the reading of my grandmother's will, the will we'd all spent a decade competing to win. The lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Before I read the distribution, Vivian left a letter she asked me to read aloud first." And he began to read my grandmother's voice from beyond the grave, and within 4 sentences. Every one of us understood that the contest we'd sacrificed 10 years of our lives to win had been rigged from the very beginning, and that the prize had never been the point. Let me back up. Because to understand why 6 grown cousins sat in a lawyer's office in stunned silence, you have to understand the game our grandmother made us play, and how long we played it, and what it cost us, and the one thing she never expected us to do, which was, at the very end, to stop playing it together. My name is Corley Ashford. I'm 34 years old, and my grandmother spent the last decade of her life making her 6 grandchildren compete against each other for her fortune, turning a family into a set of rivals. And I was one of the rivals, and I played the game as hard as any of them until the day I understood what the game was actually for. Let me tell you about my grandmother, Vivian Ashford. Vivian was the matriarch of a large and moneyed family, the widow of a man who'd built real wealth, and the sole controller of it after he died. Vivian understood something about money and power that most people are too decent to act on, that whoever controls the inheritance controls the heirs. As long as her fortune was undistributed, and as long as who got what remained an open question, Vivian held every one of her descendants in a state of permanent, striving attention. And she liked that. She liked it more than she liked any of us, I think. The attention was the thing she actually wanted. The money was just the leash. There were 6 of us grandchildren, from her 3 children, and Vivian ran us like a competition. She never said it outright. That would have been crude, and Vivian was never crude. But the message was unmistakable and constant. The inheritance was not guaranteed. It was not equal. It would go to those who deserved it, and deserving was measured by devotion to her. She dangled it. She let it be known that she was watching how we all turned out, that she was taking note of who was really there for family, that her will reflected her values and could always be revised. And she made sure we all knew that the pie was finite and the slices were unequal and the person holding the knife was her. What this did to us, to 6 cousins who, as children, had loved each other, was slow poison. Because Vivian didn't just make us compete for her approval. She made us compete against each other. She played us off, one against another, with a genius for division. She'd praise one grandchild's devotion to another, breeding envy. She'd hint that a cousin had said something unkind about you, usually invented, breeding suspicion. She'd reward the ones who visited most, gave most, flattered most, and let the others feel the cold, so that we were all constantly jockeying, comparing, resenting. She turned family gatherings into arenas. She turned cousins into rivals. She made sure that the 6 of us, who might have been each other's closest allies, instead viewed each other as competitors for a prize she controlled. And we fell for it, all of us, for 10 years. I'm not proud of it, but I won't pretend I was above it, because I wasn't. I competed. I visited when I didn't want to. I bit my tongue when Vivian was cruel, because crossing her meant losing ground. I felt the flashes of envy when she praised a cousin, the flashes of satisfaction when she praised me. I let her turn my cousins into my rivals, because the game was rigged so that not playing meant losing, and losing meant being cut out, and being cut out meant, what, exactly? That was the question I didn't ask for 10 years. What did winning actually get us? What were we so afraid to lose? Let me tell you what the decade cost, because the cost is the real story. We lost each other. That's the simple, terrible sum of it. 6 cousins who'd built forts together as children, who'd been each other's first friends, spent their adult lives as wary competitors, unable to be close because closeness was a disadvantage in a game where we were all rivals. We didn't confide in each other, because anything you revealed could be used. We didn't defend each other, because defending a rival was strategic weakness. We watched each other with the specific coldness of people competing for the same scarce thing. Vivian had taken the natural love of a family and converted it, deliberately, into its opposite, and she'd done it so gradually that we mistook the conversion for just how our family was. And here's the part that took me longest to see. The competition made us worse people. It made me smaller, more anxious, more calculating. I found myself performing devotion I didn't feel, resenting cousins I'd once loved, measuring my worth in Vivian's fluctuating approval. The game didn't just divide us from each other. It divided each of us from our own better nature. That's what a decade inside Vivian's competition did. It made a family of rivals, and it made each rival a lesser version of themselves. There were moments I sensed the wrongness of it. We all had them, I'd learn later. Moments at family gatherings when I'd catch a cousin's eye and feel, underneath the rivalry, the ghost of the child I'd loved, and feel a flash of grief for what we'd become. But the game was strong, and Vivian was masterful, and every time the family drifted toward warmth, she'd find a way, a comment, a hint, a shift in favor to pull us back into competition. She tended the rivalry like a garden. She could not allow us to unite, because a united family didn't need her, didn't fear her, didn't strive for her approval. Our division was the source of her power, and she protected it with everything she had. Vivian died when I was 33, after a long decline during which the competition reached its cruelest pitch. 6 grandchildren performing devotion at a deathbed, each terrified of losing ground in the final accounting, each watching the others, each playing the game to the last breath. It was grotesque, and we all knew it was grotesque, and none of us could stop, because stopping meant losing, and we'd been trained for a decade to fear losing above all else. And then came the will. The reading was at the office of Vivian's longtime lawyer, a man named Harold Fenn. All 6 of us were there, plus our parents, the whole family assembled for the moment we'd spent a decade competing toward. The distribution, the final accounting, the revelation of who had won. The tension in that room was unlike anything I've ever felt. 10 years of striving, about to be resolved. 6 people who'd sacrificed their relationships with each other for this moment, about to learn what it had bought them. And Harold Fenn cleared his throat and said, "Before I read the distribution, Vivian left a letter she asked me to read aloud first, to all of you, before anyone learns who receives what." And he began to read my grandmother's voice from beyond the grave. I'm going to tell you what the letter said, because it is the entire point of this story, and because I have never in my life been so completely undone by anything. "My darlings," Harold read, in Vivian's words. "By now you've spent 10 years competing for what I'm about to leave you. You've visited and flattered and striven and, I have no doubt, come to resent one another thoroughly, because that is precisely what I designed you to do. So before Harold reads the numbers, I owe you the truth about the game you've been playing. The competition was rigged, not in favor of any one of you. It was rigged in that it was never real. I decided how to divide my estate years ago, and nothing any of you did in the last decade changed it by a single dollar. The visits, the devotion, the striving, none of it mattered to the distribution, because the distribution was already set. I let you believe you were competing because I wanted the competition itself. I wanted your attention. I wanted to be the center of your lives, the axis you all turned around, and I found that the surest way to achieve that was to make you fight each other for me. A united family would have loved me and gone on with their lives. Divided family, competing for my favor, would never look away from me, so I divide you, on purpose, for 10 years. Because I was lonely and afraid of being forgotten and too proud to simply ask to be loved, so I bought your attention with a prize I never intended to award as promised. I'm telling you this because I'm dead now, and being dead has a way of making a person honest, and because I have one last thing to see whether you'll do. The estate is divided equally. Exactly equally, 6 equal shares, as it was always going to be, as I decided before the competition ever began. None of you won, because none of you could, because it was never a contest. Spent 10 years becoming rivals for a prize that was always going to be shared equally anyway. So here is my last question for you, the only one that ever mattered. Now that you know the game was a lie and the prize was always equal, and I'm gone and can no longer divide you, will you go back to being a family? Or have I broken you so thoroughly that you'll stay rivals even now, even knowing the truth, even with nothing left to compete for? I genuinely don't know the answer. I'm not sure whether I've merely borrowed 10 years of your division or made it permanent. I hope it's the former. I fear it's the latter. I won't be there to see, but you will, and it will be at last entirely up to you. Your grandmother, who loved you all equally and treated you terribly, and is sorry, and is telling you so from the only place cowards like me ever managed to be honest. The room was silent, 6 cousins sitting in a lawyer's office. You just learned that the decade that broke us apart had been a deliberate fiction, that the prize we'd sacrificed each other for had always been equal, that we'd been played against each other by a lonely woman who preferred our rivalry to our happiness. I want to tell you what happened in that silence, because it's the whole reason the story has a good ending. I looked up, and I found myself looking at my cousin Daniel, the cousin I'd been closest to as a child, before the game, before the decade, before we became rivals. And Daniel was looking at me. And in his face, I saw the ghost I'd been catching glimpses of for 10 years. The boy who'd built forts with me, the cousin I'd loved before our grandmother taught us to compete. And I saw, too, the same grief I felt, grief for 10 years lost, 10 years we'd spent as rivals because a lonely woman engineered it. And Daniel said quietly to the whole room, "She was right. That's the worst part. She broke us, and she knew she broke us, and she's sitting there dead asking whether we'll let it be permanent." He looked around at all 6 of us. "I don't want it to be permanent. I've missed you, all of you. For 10 years I've missed you, and I didn't even let myself know it because you were the competition." And something broke open in that room, not the bad kind of breaking, the good kind, because it turned out we'd all felt it, every one of us. Years of engineered rivalry, and underneath it, in every single one of us, the buried grief of a family that had loved each other and been turned into strangers. Vivian had divided us, but she hadn't destroyed the thing underneath the division, and the moment the division was exposed as a lie, the thing underneath came flooding back. Here is how it ended, and it ended in the best way any of these stories can end. Not with a villain punished, because our villain was already dead and, in her strange final honesty, already sorry, but with the thing the villain stole restored. We chose to be a family again. That was Vivian's last question, and the 6 of us answered it together, in that lawyer's office and in the months and years that followed. It was not instant or easy. A decade of engineered rivalry leaves scars, habits of suspicion, reflexes of competition that had to be unlearned. But we did the work because we'd been given something rare, the truth about what had divided us, and therefore the power to choose differently. Most families that get pulled apart never learn why, never get the letter that explains it, never get the dead engineer of their division confessing the whole scheme. We did. Vivian, in her final act, gave us the one thing that could undo her decade of damage, the knowledge that the damage was deliberate and false and ours to reject. We split the estate equally, of course, exactly as it had always been designed. But the money, which we'd spent 10 years competing for, turned out to be almost beside the point, because what we actually got back was each other, and that was worth more than any of the 6 equal shares. Hale and I are close again, as close as we were as children, closer, because now we know what it cost to lose it, and we won't lose it again. All 6 of us are a family again, a real one, chosen now rather than merely inherited, bound by the strange gift of having been divided and having found our way back. I think about my grandmother often, and my feelings are complicated, and I've stopped trying to simplify them. She did a genuinely terrible thing. She took a family that loved each other and deliberately turned them into rivals, for 10 years, to feed her own loneliness and fear of being forgotten. That's not a small cruelty. It's a decade-long emotional theft, and it cost us relationships we can never fully recover, years we can never get back. I don't forgive that easily, and I'm not sure I fully forgive it at all. But she did one thing right at the very end, and it was the most important thing. She told the truth. She could have let us go on competing forever, could have let the rigged game divide us permanently, could have taken the secret to her grave and left us rivals for the rest of our lives, never knowing why. Instead, she confessed. She exposed her own scheme, admitted her own cowardice, and handed us the truth that let us choose each other again. In her last act, the woman who spent a decade dividing us gave us the means to reunite. It doesn't erase the 10 years. But it means she didn't win in the end. Or rather that she chose, finally, to lose the game she'd been playing, because she'd come to understand too late, but not entirely too late. That a family competing for you is a poor substitute for a family that loves you, and that she'd spent 10 years buying the wrong thing. For a decade, my grandmother made her grandchildren compete against each other for an inheritance, and turned a family into rivals, and fed her loneliness with our division. The contest was rigged from the start. The prize was always equal. The competition was never real. It was all just a lonely woman's scheme to keep 6 people she loved from ever looking away from her. And at the very end, dead and finally honest, she asked us the only question that had ever mattered. Now that you know, will you be a family again? We are. That was our answer, and it was the one thing she couldn't rig, the one outcome she couldn't control from beyond the grave, because whether we'd choose each other in the end was never up to her. It was up to us. She spent 10 years making sure we'd compete, but whether we'd forgive and reunite and become a family again, that was the one prize she couldn't award and couldn't withhold. We awarded it to ourselves, together, which is the only way it was ever going to mean anything.